Humble and proud of herself and her husband, Mary and Ed Stone happily moved into a new house along with their two younger daughters, Tree and Haley. The house was beautiful. It was a house Mary thought she could only dream of owning. "This is it," Mary said, as she smiled at Ed genuinely. After they both shared a kiss, Mary and Ed finished winding down, kissed their daughters goodnight, and head to bed. During the middle of the night, Mary wakes up to her throat being extremely dry, so Mary heads downstairs to grab a glass of water to feel fresher. During the process of Mary pouring the glass of water, a screeching sound swarmed her eardrums. It sounded similar to a wooden ruler violently scraping a chalkboard. Mary, puzzled with broken shards of glass pierced in her feet, specks of her blood on the kitchen floor, she didn't know where that sound had come from. Oblivious to what had happened, Mary frantically wakes up her husband, informing him about what just happened. Together, Mary and her husband head downstairs to the kitchen to see what's going on, but surprisingly, there's no mess. No glass, no blood, no water, no sound, no nothing. Ed assumes Mary might just be fantasizing because of the lack of sleep that Mary was getting that night. Mary convinces her husband about the situation. Ed just scurries off back to bed and persuades Mary to get some rest. Mary, not happy with what her husband had to address about the conflict, she puts this situation behind her like the rest of their hardships and goes back to sleep. The following day, Mary was still worried about what had happened yesterday. She knew something was very wrong, but for now she just had to ignore it so she doesn't have to worry her husband. That morning, after Mary cooked breakfast for her family, Mary hears a knock on the door. Mary opens the door to see three women. The three women introduce themselves as the Lanes. The Lanes are Mary's neighbors. By the looks of it, the Lanes seem like some very wholesome people. The type of people to always help you during your downfall. The Lanes invited Mary to their house for the night. Mary declined because she had her children to take care of, and she didn't want to leave her husband behind. The Lanes persuaded Mary as they sensed that Mary seems to be the perfect woman with a perfect family. Mary respectfully declined once more. The Lanes understood, then walked off. That night, when everyone was asleep except for Mary, Mary decided to go to the Lanes' residence as she felt bad for declining their offer earlier. Upon walking to the Lanes' house, Mary noticed that their house looked very vacant. It was so dark and deserted, but Mary decided it was too late to turn back now. Mary went up to the front door and knocked on the house door. One of the Lane sisters opened up the front door and greeted Mary inside. As the Lanes and Mary sat down for a cup of coffee, the Lanes asked Mary about her personal life and how it feels to have the new house. Mary answered by saying that in her past, her husband and herself would argue a lot. Argue about bills or if they were really the one for one another. But ever since the new house, all those hardships are now a distant memory to Mary. The Lanes sympathized with Mary by giving her a hug, saying to Mary, if you need anything at all, to let them know. After some time over at Lane's, Mary wished them a good night and headed back to her house. After a few weeks passed, Mary and the Lanes were almost like family, being there for one another, for anything. One night, Mary woke up to grab a glass of water because her throat was feeling dry again. After doing this, Mary heard whispering coming from beneath the floor of the kitchen. Following the whispering, Mary headed down to the basement since it sounded like that's where the whispering was coming from. In the process of going down into the basement, Ed stopped her and asked her what she was doing. Mary said that she heard something coming from out of the basement. Ed, not believing Mary, said that she just needs some rest and that these instances were getting repetitive. This eventually leads to an argument, causing Mary to leave the house and go to Lane's. Mary told the Lanes about the situation in sorrow. The Lanes comforted Mary and let her sleep over at their place for the night. That morning, Mary woke up with a sharp pain in her stomach. Mary quickly left their Lane residence as she had to cook breakfast for her children that morning. At the kitchen table, Ed apologizes about what had happened the night before. Mary and Ed both settled their differences and finished eating breakfast. That night, Mary woke up to the sharp pain in her stomach again. Mary went to the bathroom to see what was going on with her stomach. As she finally looked at her stomach, she saw a marking of some sort. It looked like it had come from an ancient journal or something of that matter. Mary, not wanting to alert her husband about this, goes back to bed. About an hour later, Mary wakes up to find blood on her neck. As she realizes it's not her blood, Mary turns around to realize it's her husband's blood. His neck has been slit. Mary screams and cries in panic to what she just witnessed. Mary then frantically heads downstairs to check on her kids. When she opens the room door, she realizes that they have been killed the same way. Mary then hits her head on the room door, purposely not believing any of this to be real. Sadly, it was. With blood drenching the floor, Mary then hears those whispers coming from the basement again. That distracts her enough for her to go downstairs into the basement. As she edged closer and closer to where the whispers are coming from, Mary finds the symbol. The whispers were coming from a hidden symbol in blood on the basement floor. Mary can't believe it. It's the same symbol that was stained on her stomach. The Lanes had done this. The ones who she thought treated her like family were there only to harm her. But why? Mary then grabs a kitchen knife, using it to cut the marking out of her stomach. The pain was excruciating. As Mary screamed and tormented herself, she thought it was all worth it. After skinning the marking off, Mary then felt more pain, but this time, it was all over her body. Arms began to burst out of her ribs. Her nails began to grow in length. Her teeth began to overextend. Her spine began to bend. Her body started decomposing. As all the pain had vanished from the outside, there was still some within. With tears still on her face, Mary then crawls over to the Lane residence. Mary then crawls through the upper window, seeing that one of the sisters is in their room. Mary pounces on her, piercing her nails through her throat. There's two more she has to finish off. After two of the sisters barged through their sister's door, they found her dead with Mary on top of her. Mary then turns around slowly and asks them, why? Why had they done such a thing to a human being? For sacrifice, the sister said. If we sacrifice a human who has nothing to lose, we gain what they have owned. We left you unscathed because we wanted you to turn into this creature for you can still have a life to live. But just not as Mary, one of the sisters said. They wanted the house, the home Mary worked for. They envy it the whole time. Mary understands this, then contemplates about letting the other two live or not. Mary then makes up her decision, slicing one of the sisters' stomachs open with intestines falling out. Then grabs the other, slamming her down, ripping away at her torso flesh till she reaches bone. The Lanes were dead. With blood on her hands, Mary then fled elsewhere. No family, no home to go to, no identity. Mary had nothing. Mary then crawled farther and farther till she reached an abandoned Paris train station, far from where she used to live. As she entered the train station, leaving a trail of tears and blood behind, she noticed that it started getting extremely foggy. She heard whispers, but it didn't sound like the ones from the symbol. Depressed and resentful, Mary felt that she was in another place, another realm. Her mind was stuck on the matter of revenge. Killer name, the Deprived. Killer map, train station. Killer difficulty, intermediate. Killer weapon, claws. Killer height, average. Killer speed, 4.6 ms. Tear radius, 32 meters. Unique traits, primal stance. Cries during the start of the child to finish. Power name, crawl. All she wanted to do was live a happier life, but everything was stolen from her, including herself. This new life is all she has now. It's what they turned her into. Revenge is all she sees. Power description, crawl. Triggering crawl allows the Deprived to crawl on all fours. When on all fours, the Deprived can move faster. Pounce. When crawling, hold M2 to trigger the pounce stance. Releasing M2 allows the Deprived to pounce, injuring a survivor. Surface crawl. When next to any surface, pressing the secondary action button allows the Deprived to crawl over or on top of certain obstacles, walls, pallets, or objects. The Deprived can also pounce from one surface to another. The Deprived can also pounce off a surface to injure a survivor. Tantrum. When the Deprived pounces onto survivors, the power gauge increases. When the power gauge is fully increased, pressing shift allows the Deprived to activate Tantrum. During this phase, the Deprived crawls even faster, and any survivor hit by the pounce while Tantrum is active will be put into the dying state. Perks. Intervene. Others interfered in your goals. It's time you do the same. When a skill check is completed by any survivor within a range of 64, 96, 128 meters, their auras are revealed to you for 6, 7, 8 seconds. Hex Bloodfall. Blood is part of your tragedy. If 2 or more survivors are injured and are 6, 8, 10 meters from each other, you see their aura. This is it. Disrupt their territory like how they disrupted yours. Each time you hook a survivor, you gain 1 token. When a survivor gets hooked, all injured survivors suffer from the incapacitated stats effect for 5, 6, 7 seconds. For every token you get, increases the duration of the incapacitated stats effect by 2, 3, 4 seconds. Mori. Hold survivor still. Both survivors' arms pressed against the ground, facing the Deprived. The Deprived claws away at survivor's stomach with blood and guts pouring out of their stomach.